Since our last video on the topic, even more evidence has emerged to suggest the US really is preparing for some sort of ground operation in Iran. The build-up of forces in the region has continued apace. A number of House representatives who attended Wednesday's classified briefing came out of it signalling a ground invasion was coming, and Axios reported on Thursday that Trump's team were considering some sort of ground operation in the hopes of delivering, quote, a final blow to the regime. A few hours later, Israel announced that they'd assassinated the leader of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' naval unit, which is exactly what you do if you were planning to seize one of the islands off the Iranian coast around the Strait of Hormuz. This was then followed by a not-so-subtle statement by US Central Command, calling on all IRGC naval troops to immediately abandon their positions, and a telling comment from Trump, where, during a televised cabinet meeting, he said that seizing Iran's oil, which would probably require US forces to seize and occupy at least one of the islands, was, quote, an option. So, given that a ground invasion really does seem on the cards, in this video we thought we'd try our best to figure out what it might actually look like. Is social media as dangerous as alcohol? While you might instinctively say no, there's a historical precedent that suggests social media bans for children might be a necessary move. Read our thoughts on the debate gaining traction across the world in the latest edition of Our magazine. That's just one of 72 pages in the magazine, because as always there's more to too long than you'd expect. Purchase your copy by clicking the link in the description. So the key thing to understand here is that the US troop buildup we're currently seeing in the Middle East isn't anywhere near big enough for a full-scale invasion. No one knows exactly how many troops are in the region at the moment, but it's probably in the low tens of thousands. For context, the 2003 invasion of Iraq required something like 200,000 US troops. Iran is roughly 4 times as big as Iraq, with incredibly unforgiving terrain and an army roughly 3 times the size of the Iraqi armed forces back then, which implies a full-scale invasion would require at least a few 100,000 troops. The fact that we haven't seen a deployment of this magnitude, plus the fact that many of the units recently deployed to the Middle East have been special forces, instead suggests that, rather than a full-scale invasion, the Trump administration is planning something more targeted. So, what are Trump's options here? Well, we see at least 4. The first and most obvious move would be Kharg Island. We're not going to spend too long on this, because we've already talked about it in a number of previous videos, but the TLDR is that Kharg Island is a small 5-mile strip of land, roughly 15 miles off the Iranian mainland, that usually processes something like 90% of all Iran's oil exports. This is essentially because Iran exports most of its oil via the sea. But most of Iran's coastline is too shallow to accommodate the massive tankers that dominate maritime oil trade. Kharg Island basically solves this problem. The sea around it is deep enough, and its port infrastructure is well enough developed to accommodate those so-called supertankers. So they come and load up on Iranian oil at Kharg and then sail out through the Persian Gulf. Anyway, Trump has apparently had his eye on Kharg Island for a while. Earlier this month, for instance, Axios reported that he was considering trying to seize the island, and the US carried out a series of strikes on its military infrastructure, although notably avoided hitting any oil infrastructure, which is exactly what you'd expect before a military operation. The plan here would presumably be to seize the island, and then use it to take control of Iran's oil exports. However, this would be incredibly risky. For starters, getting there isn't easy. Kharg Island is deep inside the Persian Gulf. Aircraft could fly directly from Israel or Jordan over Saudi and Iraqi airspace, but any American ships, which the US would sort of need if its ground troops wanted heavier equipment, would have to sail up through the Strait of Hormuz and then along something like 500 kilometers of Iranian coastline. Holding it wouldn't be easy either. Any US troops on Kharg would be in range of both Iranian missiles, drones, and even artillery from the mainland. And even if troops were able to hold it, it's not clear how much leverage it would actually give Trump. Iran has other export routes, including more terminals in the Persian Gulf and the Jask terminal in the Arabian Sea. And while none of them can match Kharg's capacity, Iran could still probably export enough to keep its finances afloat, especially given oil prices would probably skyrocket. So that's the first option, Kharg. It's probably the most obvious move, but the amount of attention it's received in the press and in Washington recently has led to some speculation that this is all an elaborate bluff, and the real target is actually the islands around the Strait of Hormuz, namely Qeshm and Larak. Not only do these islands provide the basis for Iranian power projection in the strait, Iran has also apparently started redirecting traffic that would have gone through the strait between the two islands, creating a sort of de facto toll system, which is an idea Iran pushed in its most recent ceasefire demands. Seizing these islands would undermine Iran's ability to control traffic through the strait, but would, again, be far from straightforward. The US would need to seize both islands, but both are well fortified and close to the mainland, and Qeshm is pretty massive, covering an area of around 1,500 square kilometres, or roughly 2.5 Bahrains. The third option then would be to seize some of the other smaller islands near the Strait of Hormuz, like the disputed Abu Musa and Tunbs Islands. Again, these are well fortified, but further away from the mainland, and thus a bit less vulnerable. Taking these islands would be bad news for Iran, given that they host a lot of military systems and equipment, but it's not clear what additional leverage they would give the US. The fourth and final option would be to skip the islands, or maybe use them as a sort of launching pad, and go for Iran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium. For context, Iran has something like 400 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium hidden away somewhere, most likely stored in underground tunnels at Iran's Isfahan nuclear facility, which could be relatively quickly enriched up to weapons grade and would be enough to make something like 10 nuclear warheads. In the past couple of weeks, Trump has explicitly mused about sending a special forces team into Iran to secure the stockpile, which would take away one of Iran's main points of leverage. Again, however, this would be incredibly difficult. Not only would it require sending special forces deep inside Iran, they'd then have to secure hundreds of kilos of enriched uranium and transport it to a safe place. All in all, there doesn't seem to be any easy options available to Trump at the moment, and his so-called excursion in Iran is looking more like a quagmire by the day. As we mentioned earlier, the latest edition of our magazine, Too Long, is out now, which means that if you order a physical edition, it'll be shipped to you immediately, and if you buy a digital edition, it'll land in your inbox straight away. No pre-ordering, no waiting. Plus, if you subscribe while you're there using code SPRING26, you'll get your first copy for as little as £4.99, as well as 20% off every future issue as long as you stay subscribed. One other thing to know is that if you're more of a listener than a reader, which would be fair enough, we are a YouTube channel after all, then this time round we've recorded every article in Too Long, with each of our writers doing their best audiobook impression while narrating their own articles.
The New Age of Empires. Written and read by Georgina Finley.
If you want that, then you can sign up to our new Too Long and TLDR Party bundle. That gets you a copy of the magazine, but also access to TLDR Party, our new subscription. Party members not only get access to the audio versions of every article, they also get access to our documentaries, like our new series Leaders and Losers and our upcoming documentary we're recording in Greenland right now. They get access to our behind-the-scenes podcast, The Bullpen, our bonus podcast, The Last Move, their name printed in every issue of our magazine, and more. Find out more about TLDR Party by clicking the link in the description, where you'll also find a link to subscribe to Too Long and our documentaries.